Hi, welcome back to the Lumbermill devlog. If you're new here, Lumbermill is a game I'm developing solo about building and running a lumbermill on your own densely forested island. A huge part of the game is managing staff, each with their own unique design. Early in the game's development, the lumberjacks, mechanics and arborists went through a few design iterations. I started with these purple squares gliding about just to have something visual in place before a very crude first attempt at drawing a lumberjack without any animation. I eventually designed these guys, adding randomised skin tones, hairstyles, and hair colours. It was the start of a concept, but the designs haven't kept up with the game's art style, and they have some major problems that I've finally now gotten around to figuring out. Firstly, the game needs female employees. The code has always been there, and female names are generated, but visually that's not possible with the old design. Secondly, the designs themselves don't fit in with the game's art direction, and I know that now I can do better. Thirdly, the proportions are off, and that makes them look pretty big alongside the trees. Arborists are just lumberjacks with a green tint as well, which looks terrible. There's also a whole list of other stuff which I'm aiming to fix with a redesign. So I got to work on a new design that I can use as a baseline to add variations to. First up, I just wanted to get the scale right alongside the trees, while still keeping the head big for detail and the rest of the proportions in line with that. I eventually arrived at this design, which I put up alongside the older iterations for comparison. It's 3 pixels shorter than the old design at 32 pixels, and that's about as short as I can make it to still allow for randomized variation. The plan here is to have a basic design which all employee types will be based on. Depending on their job, I'll use a shader to recolor their uniforms and skin tones. Separately, I'll design hairstyles which will be recolored and layered on top, and a shader will generate shadows for the underlying sprite, depending on the skin tone and uniform color. All of this should create a system that allows for loads of variation from relatively few drawings. I wanted to make sure that any designs I make look right in-game, so I opened up the template that all lumberjacks are based on and reluctantly deleted most of the structure there, as the old system used separate objects for most of the layers. I also removed all of the old animations to make the slate as clean as possible before opening up my IDE, Rider, to delete the obsolete code that handled the old animations before dealing with the inevitable errors. I've been an avid user of Rider since I started this channel, so I'm delighted that JetBrains have sponsored this video. Until now, Rider has been paid software, but it's now completely free for non-commercial use. Rider's beautiful and clutter-free interface was what initially drew me to it back in 2019, and it was the speed and efficiency it brought to my work that convinced me it's genuinely the best IDE on the market. Rider's helpful yet unobtrusive code suggestions have made me a better programmer, and its seamless integration with Unity makes debugging a frequently enjoyable part of the process. For tasks you find yourself doing often, intuitive shortcuts make editing code in Rider feel like second nature. And for more complex changes, Rider provides a full suite of refactoring options for every context that make daunting or intricate tasks take just seconds. Out of the box, Rider has full support for Unity, Godot, and Unreal, so no matter what engine you prefer, you can get the full benefit of Rider's excellent game and software development tools.
Follow the link in the description to create your games for free with Rider.
Heading back to Unity, I started with just the one standing pose for the lumberjacks in-game. It was a start, but quite difficult to tell how things would turn out animated, as obviously this gliding movement isn't quite the vibe I'm going for. So I gave myself the green light to start drawing the first of 4 walk animations. This is the south variation, and I'll need to make versions for north, east, and west too. I find that it helps to start with really vibrant block colours to visualise the layers and focus more on the shapes before worrying about details. I designed 4 frames to start with, 2 with the legs fully extended in each direction, and 2 with the employee upright in the middle of the walk cycle. Then I drew 4 more in between frames to fill the gaps, bringing the full walk cycle to 8 frames in total. This is how the finished animation looks with shading, and alongside the old animation, I think it's a huge improvement. Obviously, this guy is bald, and that allows me to layer hair on top later like a wig. In Unity, I imported that animation, and the default of 60 frames per second was obscenely speedy, so I had to actually check how long each frame is displayed in the original animation. I had it set to 100 milliseconds per frame, which works out at a frame rate of 10 frames per second. Once I'd adjusted that, in-game I was happy with how the animation itself looked, but obviously I don't have the other variations needed to sell the illusion of a lumberjack walking around. The drawing process for those other animations was mostly the same, with the west animation essentially being the south animation, flipped and with some slightly adjusted shading. I could also do the same thing for north and east. Once I got those all set up, this is how they looked in game. Actually seeing the animations working like this and facing the right directions really made a big difference, and although it took quite a while, I could finally see this new design heading in a direction I was happy with. So now onto the more technical aspect. I need a shader to be able to replace colours on this original sprite. I started with Unity's default sprite shader and made changes from there. I can set up any number of colour replacements I want right on the employee object, and here you can see it working by recolouring the red lumberjack colours to blue. This works by generating a tiny texture that acts as a replacement palette for the shader. I can also use this for changing skin tones, so I set up 5 skin tones ranging from light to dark, which the game selects at random. Thankfully, that worked first time, and we're starting to get somewhere with the staff variations. While doing all of this, I've been living in Scotland and tried to make the most of autumn before the cold of winter arrives. I found this coastal forest, which has quickly become one of my favourite places to get some space and find new inspiration for the game. I've had a lot going on personally that's been pretty tough, and having a place like this to just enjoy the quiet is so important. I guess that's why I find myself constantly returning to this game about forests and sticking with the concept for so long. Anyway, next up was a series of failed attempts to combine the hair and body textures in a single shader. Having them both in the same shader is ideal, as it makes things like recolouring and generating outlines and shadows a lot easier. My first idea was this highly creative but deeply broken approach of creating a gradient for marking out the hair area on the walk animations. I'm not even going to try to explain this, as it failed catastrophically. The more measured approach of just telling the shader what pixel coordinates to draw the hair at worked a lot better, and means I can animate the hair position alongside the sprite, so things like bobbing up and down as the employees walk is easy to add. Each hairstyle needs 4 variations for north, south, east and west, and I just draw them in white so they can be recoloured in game. I also use a dark grey colour to indicate where the shadows fall on the hair itself, and magenta for pixels where a shadow should be drawn if there's anything beneath it. And that worked. Lumberjacks have hairstyles, varied skin tones and varied hair colours. Hair also casts a shadow on the skin and clothing. I also drew another few hairstyle variations, and after a lot of experimentation with something called the stencil buffer, I got the shader displaying silhouettes of any staff hidden behind tall objects like trees and buildings. To be able to distinguish between the different job types, lumberjacks, arborists and mechanics, I also spent a bit of time testing out different colours for their uniforms. Mechanics and lumberjacks are blue and red respectively, and while arborists have had green uniforms until now, I decided white would probably be a better choice. Green is hard to distinguish from all the other greens in the game, and as they're mostly scientific in their work, the lab coat seems to work well. For colourblind players, I know that relying on colour differences alone could cause some issues, so I've got some ideas in mind for other ways to distinguish the job types visually. I tried using pixel outlines for the silhouettes, matching the colours for each job type, but found the contrast too low. I also tried the outlines in white, but then that was too distracting. I eventually settled on this, just shading the silhouette area a bit darker than usual to look like a shadow. At the moment, there are over 1,000 different variations possible, and I'll be adding more variations and animations in the future, but that's for a later devlog. If you want to follow along with development, do make sure to subscribe. Special thanks for this video go to my patrons, and in particular, I'd like to thank Matthias Bader, Pepsi, Kleb, and Yelp1. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.